Stay away from hypotheticals, stay away from talking about the future. Focus on the present, and in particular, the past, because past is the greatest predictor of what's going to happen in the future for your customer. And what is immediately in front of them is going to influence them in terms of what they're motivated to do. So if they are motivated to do something, that's where you need to live. In terms of what they may be planning in the future down the road, you can consider that a lie at this point because there's just so many variables and it's not front and center for them at the moment. So instead, focus on present, focus on past. So we're going to show you how to focus on what I consider to be a problem worth solving, because not every problem is. Another principle in this process, mistakes that I see made as well too, is right. If you're building a product business, you can't build a solution around every individual customer problem. That's going to lead to your product becoming a mess because not every customer is going to have the same problem. So for every problem you uncover, you build a solution for that and you build that into your product, then your product's going to wind up having a ton of functionality that applies to everybody, which means it applies to nobody. If it's got too much going on, it's going to be a confusing, just like tangled mess. So instead, what you need to do is you need to build around the problem patterns, as I refer to them. This visual is intended to show you what that means, right? These two overlapping concentric circles, the idea is that those are unique customers or customer data that you have, maybe for a vertical or an individual or whatever. The gap, the overlap, that's where you want to focus. Because if you build solutions for that percentage, that's going to apply to all of those customers, right? So you may not be able to check every box for every customer all the time, but that's the way it should work. Even if your customers experience frustration with regard to that process. Another thing to keep in mind here is there's a difference between what people say they're going to do and what their priorities are and what they will actually do. That's why it's good to, with the feedback Mark had earlier, follow the money, right? Because the money is going to drive you in the direction in terms of where you need to go, right? If a customer says, I need 5 features yesterday, so like I need A, B, C, D, and E, whatever, right? I need all of them. And you push, like you're scrambling because you're like, oh my goodness, we only typically build 1 feature. How am I going to build 5? A way to really cut through that to figure out which one they really need is to say how much, what it's going to cost. Be like, okay, it's going to cost $100 per feature. Which feature would you like to buy first? When you make them show up with the money, the story usually changes. Well, you know what? I didn't need the other 4. I really need 1 of those. Right? I need C. The other 4 can then wait if you're going to charge us for it, right? So like that sounds like it might be a little contentious, but that's a huge win for you because what they really did was they prioritized their problems for you. That said, I don't care about those other 4. I only care about that 1. Why do they care about that 1? Because they're willing to vote with their wallet for that 1, which means that the pain of that problem is great enough to the point where they really need a solution for that 1 and they don't need it for the others. So focus on the patterns, not the individuals, right? Your goal is ultimately to block as many changes to your product as possible because changes to your product are risky, right? Most changes to most products make the product experience worse. It's another reason why I say resist coding, resist adding to your product whenever possible until it's painfully obvious that that's what the customer needs. And then once it's painfully obvious that that's what the customer needs, that means there's a much higher probability that's actually going to improve your product experience and solve problems for your customer.
John, I love that point. And I like one of the examples in the book. The author emphasizes the power of asking, why do you need that feature or what are you going to do with it? Because he found a few instances of misunderstanding where they were asking for a new dashboard or something and he spent all this time building it. But at the end of the day, it turned out, they just needed a weekly report that like could have been done, solved a different way. And he was so desperate to be customer service oriented that he didn't ask why or what are you going to do with it? And it could have lowered the cost, but also kept the value on both sides. I thought that was a fascinating example.
Great point. The why is your best friend. Understanding the why behind your customer's behavior, why they do what they do is going to tell you everything. And you need to push for that always. If you don't understand it, then it's not something worth building. It's not something that's a real problem. If they can't justify it for you, still not a problem, right? So we are looking to essentially eliminate problems from contention because problems ultimately are going to lead to solutions, which ultimately lead to features in your product, which ultimately lead to changes in your product, right? You see the pattern here. So really push for that why. And that comes from this process, getting this data. I also see a couple questions in here. Let's see. The one question is related from Adam in terms of how do you overcome inertia of any existing processes and risk tolerance in the process? They want solutions, but they can't use it. That's still technically not your problem. I'd say that because I want to be protective over your product and your product experience in terms of if they want to use it, but they can't use it, there may not be anything you can do about that. Until they can use it, you should still resist the nature to build those solutions into your product. Instead, you can focus on maybe why they can't use it at the moment to see if there's anything you do to get that process unstuck, basically. So there might be external factors that are impacting the ability for your solution to get in there. For example, one of the customers that we have, we want to build a feature into a product that their user desperately needs, but they're regulated against having that feature in the product. So as such, we came up with a workaround in terms of how it would work so that they weren't out of compliance, but they could still get some form of that functionality that they desperately wanted. So in that way, that enabled us to move the needle in terms of that product experience and solve a portion of that problem without having to have them fall out of compliance in any way. Okay. So I want to make sure I'm keeping track of time here, right? Patrick, we're good until the half hour, right?
About 20 minutes remaining. Yep.
Okay, cool. I might skip ahead and jump to some of the questions after I blast through a couple of these because I think this stuff is relevant. So let's see what we can get through, and I'm going to speed it up a little bit just so I'm paying more close attention to time so we get through some of the stuff. So this buckets and marbles is a visual I use to think through how do I get this data? How do I organize this data, right? We know the process is important, but what do I do with the data I get? This visual here is intended to say, for every problem, every validated problem that your customer mentions in this process, you create a bucket, right? So A, B, and C, those are unique problems. Then you're going to be looking for, as you're doing more research, if you hear another instance of that same problem, right? Same characteristics, that's a marble. You put that marble in a bucket you already have, right? If you're hearing about a new problem, you create a new bucket, right? If you hear about another instance of that problem, you put a marble in the bucket. This is an effort to figure out, how do I weigh these buckets from heaviest to lightest, which means this is a framework to use to identify what are the biggest problems. So use this framework in order to organize this data after you're starting to collect it, right? Because it's a lot of qualitative data. So it's helpful to have a framework to organize it. So these are the questions, and I'll share these slides with Patrick and everyone so that you guys have them in terms of using them. But this is the process to go through to basically validate a problem, right? The other thing I want to do, this is what we use at NxtStep, in order to say whether or not this problem is legitimate or not, in terms of should we consider building a solution to this problem, right? And again, this applies from very earlier on in your product company to idea stage, all the way to and through your growth stage. In one instance, you're building, and the other one you're adding to. But to go through these, right? Number one, if I'm in a conversation with a customer, what problems are you experiencing? And you can add on to that related to X, which is industry specific or in the direction of where we think we may want to build. Number two, how are you solving that problem today? Right? If they don't have a good answer for this question, that means it's not really a problem. So if they bring up a problem and then I say, how are you solving it today? And they're not, chances are that it's not a big enough problem for them to necessarily worry about at the moment, because for the problems we have, we look for solutions one way or the other. So you want to make sure that they're actually looking for some form of a solution to it. Now, if we understand how they're solving it today, the next natural question is, how well does that solution work? Why? Because we want to know what our product is ultimately going to be compared against, right? If the solution to the problem that they mentioned works 9 times out of 10, then you've got a really high bar to beat in terms of getting them to use your product, right? The solution we have works 90% of the time. That's probably not a problem worth solving, right? I went back to thinking about problems worth solving. We're going to probably pass on that one. Now, if another problem pops up and that solution they have for that problem works 2 times out of 10, that sounds much more interesting to me at this point. So that's how you figure out whether or not to eliminate a problem based on that question. The next one, and really the rest of them, are to figure out the impact of the problem, right? How significant is the impact? Because they could have a problem. They could have a solution for that problem. They're trying to solve it. The solution may not work very well, but the impact may be low. If the impact is low, their motivation will be as well too to solve that problem with your product. So you need to make sure that you have that context as well, right? If the impact of that problem, if I only lose $1 every month because of that problem, as opposed to if I'm losing $1 million every month because of that problem, that sounds like a very different level of motivation for me to solve that problem. Right? So this is a framework worth using as well too, in terms of managing this process. So this we kind of just went through, so I'm going to gloss over this one, but this is essentially thinking through eliminating problems throughout the process, right? So like I mentioned before, if you're solving it, if they're not attempting to solve it, that's a problem. If the solution they have already works relatively well, then you have a really high bar, and chances are you're not going to be able to beat that solution. And then if the impact is low, then it's something you're going to avoid as well too. But this process is to say that here's how you go through the process. A, B, C, D are the problems in this case that they're talking about in conversation. The questions we laid out before are basically what you want to go through in sequence to eliminate the problem. Your objective is to eliminate that problem. If it passes all of your tests, now it's something worth taking a closer look at. And that's when it becomes a marble that goes into the bucket. So you go across and then you go down. These are really just some general tips in terms of how to manage the interview process. So keeping it casual, it's a conversation, it's not an interview, right? Like good sales is done as though you're fast friends and like you're listening, they're talking as much as possible. So do minimal amount of speaking, do a maximum amount of listening, right? That way you're going to learn as much as you possibly can. Be prepared with detailed notes and make sure you're ready with next steps. The process should all be connected, right? At the end of my problem interview, I'm teeing up my solution interview. At the end of my solution interview, I'm teeing up my MVP or my product interview, right? So there's always a next step and always get their permission. Is it okay with you if we reach back out here, then, when, whatever, for this reason? That way, they have it in their head. You're managing their expectations. You're going to be reaching back out to them. Avoiding bad data. We talked a lot about these, so I'm just going to bounce over this one, but stay away from talking about ideas and solutions. It's only going to get you in the hot water. No selling. It's all learning. Building around the patterns, right? We talked about it. And then real commitment, real vote towards what you're working on comes in the form of money in terms of them paying you, right? So avoid this pitfall, which is giving the product away or not charging for the product. That's not the kind of traction you're looking for. And someone that uses a free product can actually create more problems for you than you might originally be thinking about. So the last one, which I mentioned briefly as well too, is about focusing on the history. History is the best predictor, right? I have some links that I'll share with you guys, but they talk about people's attendance at the gym, where they go to like a Planet Fitness and they're asking the people that are there, how many days a week do you go to the gym? And they say, I come every day. I'm here every day. Like every day of every week I'm here. And then they go back and they look at their history and it's been weeks since they've been at the gym. So, that's a huge difference. And again, they're not intending to be misleading. That might be how they're thinking of it. We don't want to focus on their ideas or how they're thinking of it. We want to focus on their previous behavior because that's going to dictate where we go moving forward. This is intended to dictate kind of the free versus paid arrangement, right? Simply put, get paid for your product. Please don't give your product away for free. That starts the relationship off in improper setting, and it's only going to make your life harder moving forward, right? Pilots, all that kind of stuff will get you in trouble if you're offering it for free without setting expectations appropriately. So, right, you're creating a business. You are going to be generating revenue. Otherwise, you're not going to have any profit, right? Your model may be unique, but they're going to have to pay for your product, and they should pay for your product right out of the gate. If they're unwilling to do so, as in they say they'll use it for free, but they won't pay for it, then you're not solving the right problem. It's not a matter of whether or not you should charge or whether or not your product is ready or any of that stuff. You haven't focused on a problem that's painful enough for them to get out the wallet and pay for access to your product. Another way to think about it is if you need to encourage them to use your product, you can reduce the price that you're charging them, but you should always be charging them. And you want to set the expectations for what that price might be at a later date. So for example, instead of giving the product away for free, offer a 90% price reduction in the beginning. So instead of $100 a month, it's going to be $10 a month, but it's 90% off. And say in 90 days, it's going back up to $100 a month, right? You're still paying the same as though if you were charging $10 out of the gate, but now they know that the price is going back up. So instead, they're thinking of it very differently, right? They're thinking they're getting a 90% off, but they're still paying, as opposed to at some point in the future, you're going to raise your price by 10 times. So even though technically you did the same thing, it's a very different experience for your customer. So manage those expectations as well too. The last thing I'll say from a theory perspective before we jump into some questions and use the remaining time for that is how to think about fundraising. I know some of you sounds like already have, some of you are probably preparing for it. This data, the traction you'll make is all very related to fundraising, right? Your investors are going to be validating whether or not you know your customers really well and you can define the opportunity really well. One of the common pitfalls that sinks a lot of companies in the fundraising process is they can't adequately describe the problem space in which they compete. They can't describe the problem. They can't say who it's for. They can't say how many people experience it. They can't say how much it costs, right? They immediately, just like I said before, the common pitfall, they launch into the solution. They launch into the product. Like, we got all these features. We got all this tech. Great. Investors don't care about that at all. They care about how well do you know the problem space? How big is this problem you're solving, right? And then ultimately later down, okay, fine, how are you solving it? So thinking about it in that way. And for what will make your fundraising process easier with this analogy is if you can start the fire by yourself. It doesn't matter if you start a small fire. You've already created the fire, and that's the lion's share of the effort. So if you have some traction, if you have some revenue, right, and you're growing, it doesn't matter how slowly you're growing. The point is you're growing, right? Because you can always make a small fire bigger. But if you haven't started that fire, that's kind of the litmus test for the investors to see, if you have traction, if you have progress, then you can start to shift the balance of power here in terms of like, what I would recommend is don't go to investors to work on your idea or your startup. Go to investors when you're ready to grow. You can get there. If you can get there by yourself or with your current team, that's going to make your life so much easier when it comes to fundraising. So I recommend those principles whenever too. And as a nice kicker, you'll get some favorable terms. I was going to take a brief break, but I'm just going to go right straight through if that's okay with you, Patrick. The rest of the balance of this is to kind of dive into some questions and get some feedback. So I'll probably bounce around there a little bit. Cheryl, if you wouldn't mind sharing the survey for this question. Guys, go ahead and give me an answer in terms of whether or not we think this question is good or bad. Let's see what that result looks like. And the question in front of you is, do you think it's a good idea? Right? This might be a question I ask a customer. Let me know when we're ready, Cheryl. We'll take a look at the results. 90% of you said this is a bad question. I would definitely agree. This is a bad question for a whole host of reasons, but it's not up to an individual customer to decide whether or not any ideas are any good. And you shouldn't be talking about ideas anyway, right? We're talking about problems here. So avoid any conversation about ideas. The market is going to determine whether or not your idea is any good, not any individual customer. So stick with talking about the problems. Opinions are not worth a whole lot. So don't even ask for them. All right, let's keep moving.
I also add, Sean, this question presumes that you've presented the idea. You've gone in and you've shown, hey, I've got this idea for an app. I've got this idea for a solution. I'm really excited. I've exposed my ego, right, as Rob says. And so it's highly unlikely to get a truthful response anyway, because they don't want to, they might hedge even unintentionally. So I thought that was important.
Agreed. Yeah, couldn't agree more, right? It's leading. You're leading the person to tell you, again, what they think you want to hear. So you're opening it up for bad data. So you got to control that. Don't let them do that. All right, let's keep going. Let's pull another one out of here. How about this one? If you guys can see it, it says, would you buy a product that did X? Good. Okay. So similarly, skewing towards the bad direction, but a little bit more positive on this response. This one, still a bad question. Think about the principles we talked about earlier, right? One of the problems with this question is it's talking about the future. We want to avoid talking about the future because there's just too many unknowns. So avoid that whenever possible because both are going to be misleading. It talks about a hypothetical product that doesn't exist and the future, both of which we have very little control over and we really can't be too predictable with. So anything about the future should be considered a lie and just as a minimum going to be misleading you. In addition to that, there's just too many variables to control. Well put. Great point, Patrick. Thanks for sharing that as well too. All right, let's jump to Another one I got here. Let me get to some of the questions that further later in the workflow here. Here's two. Sure, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit to go to how are you dealing with it now? And feel free to start that one. Otherwise, we could just talk it out. And then now we're coming up on time. I could talk about this stuff all day, so I'm trying to make sure it fits into the window here.
Or we could open up to comment on that question, Sean, or or general questions or pushback or anything that's on people's minds.
Yeah, I think this is a good question because if they've already got a solution that's non-manual, and I'm trying to sell an automated solution, this is a great question.
I would concur with that synopsis as well. Also. Good question. Again, let's think about why, because we're dealing with what's going on here and now, right? And we're going to learn more about their process, right? So the more we can learn about that, the better. It's a perfect opportunity to talk about their workflow, and it could give us an opportunity to anchor the price, right? So it gives us an opportunity to learn more about impact, what it costs, how it works, right? Everything that we can learn about existing workflow is going to be super helpful in terms of asking a question like this. And we all need to do a survey with this one, but here's another question. Who's got an opinion about this one? Where does the money come from? See some thumbs up. Anybody want to issue an opinion out loud?
Can you clarify the question? Meaning, where does the money come from? To pay for this or?
Exactly. Yep. That's correct, Adam. So this is basically driving towards, right? It could be a couple of things. It could be like problem, impact. Where does that money come from to solve it today? And where would the money come from essentially to pay for your product?
Right, because even if there is an ROI, it's possible that they've already budgeted for something to solve it.
Yep.
And if it's in the budget, then you can tap into that.
Indeed. This is an invaluable question for someone on the B2B side to be asking. Maybe a little bit odd for any of those working in the B2C space, but this is great to figure out how people are thinking about whether or not they would buy your product. If you get incomplete data to this answer, that's a problem, right? Problem that might indicate you're focusing on the wrong problem. If you get concrete data from this, you're going to learn about your potential users or your customers' buying process, which is invaluable. You need to understand that. That's going to be critical for setting up a repeating sales process, a successfully repeatable sales process, I should say. So
it also feels like this question would get you to potentially another stakeholder or another decision maker you need to convince. If they say, oh, well, that's so-and-so in this department pays when that happens.
Absolutely. However many people are involved in the decision-making process, where the budget comes from, how much budget is available, who knows what you're going to learn, right? I learned most of the valuable information about my competitors' products by asking prospective customers about my competitors' products. They tell me everything. They tell me how much they cost. They tell me what the process is. They tell me what the steps are, right? I could peruse their websites and use their products all day, and I'm never going to learn that information. But I ask prospects about my customers, and I learn everything. They tell me everything because they want me to beat that stuff. So they're pretty straightforward with it. I know we didn't go through all the questions. There's a lot more to talk about on all of these topics. I want to be sensitive to time here. The questions like these are peppered throughout the mom test. So highly recommend getting a copy of that in addition to any of these other books that I have listed here as well too. If you're in this process, you need to read all of these. I've read all of them multiple times, and they're intended to be delivered in order of sequence as well too, to start at the top and work your way down to the bottom. Mom test, we've talked a lot about. Nail It, Then Scale It is basically the book I would write. I read it and it sounds creepy because it sounds like the things I say, but it's a fantastic book. So please get a copy of that as well too. Running Lean is pretty straightforward. It's all about lean startup life. Product-led growth is about how to create a product experience which gets people using your product as fast as possible and encourages learning. Hooked is all about building habit-forming technology, whether it's physical, whether it's virtual, it doesn't matter. You want to develop habits with your customers that are using your products routinely. And then obviously Awesome is about positioning. After you have users, after you've got them working on your product, how do I niche down from the subset of customers that I have that are getting a ton of awesome value out of my product, which can send you to the next level of success. So recommend all of those books as well too. And then my contact information is in here as well too. This is the things that we do, but that's probably straightforward. user research, customer discovery, MVP builds, product training, product strategy sessions, whatever. That's my contact information as well too. Please don't hesitate to text me, call me, email me, whatever. Right. My goal is to help rid the world of product failure. So everyone's product company can be successful with the right process, and don't worry about the meter being on or being charged for that stuff or whatever. Unless you really, really need the help and you specifically want to work together very intensely, very quickly, that you're not going to be charged for reaching out to me. I just want to help as much as I possibly can. So please take advantage of that as well too.
Thank you, Sean. Excellent. So much good stuff. And we're lucky that Sean is local too. So it's not hard to, we'll send out this info. So if anyone has follow-up questions, I'm hoping that we do. I do. I want to talk to Sean more about this stuff because it's so foundational, right, to everything else. So thank you, Sean. Thank you to everyone for sticking around for a good session. And I took a screenshot of some of those book recommendations because there's always more, and maybe one of those will be our next session coming up later. All right.
Thanks for having me, everyone.
All right.
Have a great weekend and good luck.
Right.
Thank you.
Hey, Sean. Bye, everyone.
See you guys.
Thanks.
Nice job, Sean.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you.